Welcome to the Wiener Conference Call series. These one-hour, on-the-record phone calls feature leading experts from Harvard Kennedy School who answer your questions on public policy and current events. Wiener Conference Calls recognize Malcolm Wiener's role in proposing and supporting this series, as well as the Wiener Center for Social Policy at Harvard Kennedy School.
Good day, everyone. I am Mari Mejias in the Office of Alumni Relations and Resource Development at Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this Wiener Conference Call, which is kindly sustained by Dr. Malcolm Wiener, who supports the Kennedy School in this and so many other ways. Today, we are joined by Eric Rosenbach, who is the co-director of Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He's also a lecturer in public policy. He previously served as the Pentagon's Chief of Staff and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Security, responsible for leading all aspects of the department's cyber activities and other key areas of defense policy. On Capitol Hill, he served as National Security Advisor for then-Senator Chuck Hagel, and in the private sector, he worked in cybersecurity for global companies. A former Army intelligence officer and commander of a telecommunications intelligence unit, he has co-authored several books on national security. Given his deep expertise, we are so fortunate that he's agreed to share his thoughts today with the Kennedy School's alumni and friends. Eric.
Hello, good morning, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Thank you again to the Wieners for allowing us to have this. And it's really great to see so many familiar names in the participants list. And as you can see, I'm doing a little virtual background, try to give you the feeling of being back in the classroom at the Kennedy School. But beware, that means that I may also cold call on some of you who are particularly deserving. So what I'd like to do is for about the next 20 minutes or 22 minutes, just give you a little background brief on some issues that I think might be of interest, but then really want to spend the vast majority of the time having a conversation with you all. Some really good questions that I saw in advance. Even better, we'll take some questions live and just see what you all are thinking about these issues. So I do have a little bit of a deck. I'm going to go ahead and share that now, and hopefully our tech is working here, and talk you through some of the things that will be the key. But the idea here is that I would like to talk about the nexus of traditional geopolitics and technology and some of the key challenges that the Biden administration is facing right now. So I think here's the short agenda. And you know, it wouldn't be the Kennedy School if you didn't have a little bit of an analogy to start with. And this normally is where I would cold call on someone, but I think a question I'd like for you to ask in your mind is this like old school risk, traditional geopolitical type situation where you're trying to figure out who you should ally with, or this is a new great game where you have to think about technology as an enabler and in a different way, and maybe even a little bit about how you connect economic policy with technology and security policy. Also, wouldn't be the Kennedy School if I didn't give you a very basic framework through which I think you can think through some of these challenges. This is pretty straightforward. You see here, it's national security, economic strength, and of course, our principles being important to us. And I then would like to start just by giving you a little bit of an overview of things that are in the paper today. Now that you have that as a framework, go back up and just take a look at some of the headlines today, starting with Russia, when you see that the administration has rolled out a set of new, pretty biting sanctions, all because of things that the Russians were doing as they relate to technology, primarily, again, trying to interfere with the elections, conducting information operations, responsible for the massive SolarWinds hack in which they got in the supply chain of a software firm and used that to get into many different organizations, including in the US government. A lot of tension with Russia right now from an old school perspective supposedly in response to a comment that President Biden made about Putin. Putin mobilized pretty significant troops along the border of Ukraine and is now threatening an invasion. That's old school geopolitics going against the new school tech. Something to keep in mind. Look at a lot of the tension with China right now. Just last week, the Chinese flew fighter aircraft over Taiwanese airspace, something very unusual, pretty provocative. as you'll see in some of the other slides that I'm going to present, a lot of strategic competition with the Chinese right now in three key sectors, as I'll show you again. And even a country like Iran, if you looked at the news last week, seems like there was an offensive cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear program. From what the newspapers tell me, sounds like it was the Israelis. Important aspect of technology and competition there. And that has ratcheted up pressure for the Biden plan to try to reopen negotiations on the Iranian nuclear program. The Iranians responded by saying they were going immediately to 60% enrichment of highly enriched uranium, which puts them on the path to a bomb in a much quicker way. So you see what's happening in the news and some of those traditional geopolitical plays. And as I mentioned, what I'd like to do then is go back to talk a little bit about three particular areas of technology that I think you should watch. And they're here. You see I have 5 listed, but I think all of you've heard so much about AI and 5G that they now seem, kind of old school. What I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about is about semiconductors, digital finance, and then a little bit about space, and talk about how there is a nexus with geopolitical competition, and then really, get some of your thoughts. The one other thing I want to start by saying is just that I personally think the Biden administration has a really good team in place right now. All of those senior officials have a lot of experience, whether it's someone like Avril Haines as the Director of National Intelligence, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, very experienced Director of the CIA, Tony Blinken. There's a good team there. They are old school. It's a lot of the same characters that luckily is supported by a lot of new, younger, and a lot of Kennedy School grads that are much more diverse and have a different background. We can talk about that as well. So let's take a look at this, our framework, thinking through semiconductors, digital finance, and space. And just keep this framework in mind as I work through this. The first one I'd like to talk a little bit about is semiconductors, which normally would seem pretty boring and not really a significant part of any national security or foreign policy discussion, but mostly in connection with the United States trying to push back on a Chinese firm known as Huawei, which had become very dominant in 5G telecom infrastructure. The US implemented a lot of export controls that may actually have the impact of pushing Chinese work to develop their own semiconductor industry forward. And so that's one of the things that we'd want to think about. If right now, the US actually has a pretty strong and dominant position in the semiconductor area, along with the Taiwanese and South Koreans, I think we would want to think very carefully about what we do to encourage, in some ways, the Chinese to build their own organic industry. So let's just think about what that means. This now, in conjunction with some supply chain issues that have been exacerbated by COVID, has led to a shortage of semiconductors in the United States, to the point that you saw last week in the news that some major US auto manufacturers aren't able to get things off the production line because they're lacking these semiconductors. The effect that it's had in China for several years now is that very quickly growing semiconductor industry, still nascent. This is not an easy thing to master, but you see that growing much like it grew in the telecom sector with Huawei. So want to think about whether the balance should be more on security or the economy for the United States. One good example of how you think about these from a pretty sophisticated perspective. The next thing that I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is digital finance. So in the US, we think about this from a mostly simplistic perspective of you have Apple Pay, or maybe you use PayPal, or maybe, if you're in the private sector, you're experimenting with Stripe or Square, some other type payment systems. But in China, the payment platform technology is much superior to the United States, as is the penetration and the number of people who are using mobile payments on smartphones or otherwise for all of their transactions. Here's why that matters. The Chinese have started to roll out, officially as of last week, a digital currency known as the digital yuan. Again, for a lot of people in the United States, the idea that a digital yuan or the yuan at all could displace the dollar and dollar dominance that has been pervasive since World War II seems far-fetched. But the US is quite far behind. And quite frankly, the leading competition to a digital yuan is Libra, a Facebook-backed digital token led and kind of initiated by Mark Zuckerberg. And I think you have to ask whether that's something that ever would really be trusted by Americans. You can see here the very basic explanation of the difference between cryptocurrency, which you're also reading a lot about. We could talk more about that, digital cash, and digital payments. A true digital dollar would be backed by the US Fed, and something that, the liability then would be the responsibility of the US government. Why does that matter to someone like me? I'm not, a finance person, don't ever really want to work in the private sector in that way, is that I think it has pretty significant geopolitical implications. So about a year and a half ago, the Belfer Center ran in the forum, back in the day when we could all gather in the forum. We ran a crisis simulation about some of the things that could happen in the world if the digital yuan, 5 years from that point, got more influence. And here are some of the things that we saw when we gathered a group of former senior leaders like former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, Nick Burns, rumored to be possibly the ambassador to China or Russia, we don't know. Megan O'Sullivan, former Deputy National Security Advisor, some real heavyweights who played out a scenario in which, because of the digital yuan, countries like North Korea and Iran were able to evade sanctions because they were outside the control of a dollar-backed currency. So that's still debatable, but one thing that I think I would like at least for you all to consider as something on the horizon. The next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is about space. It was the case, only 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when I was in the Department of Defense as Assistant Secretary and had space as part of my portfolio, that the US was completely reliant on Russia to produce and then give us rocket engines. This is a crazy thing, but it is true. The US did not have a domestically produced rocket engine because for so long we'd been dependent on Russian technology, and that sector, had really weakened. Part of that is that the space sector had been locked up a lot by government contractors and defense contractors in particular. This has changed a lot, and that's what I'd like to highlight, is there now is a lot of geopolitical competition in space, some of it from the military perspective. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But quite frankly, a lot of it just thinking about ways to get to innovative ways to get to more natural resources down the road. I talked about semiconductors. There's an aspect of the resources that go into making semiconductors that are in these rare earth minerals, also really important for battery technology, which is key when you think about the greening of the economy. And the Chinese, for example, were the first ones to launch a mission to the dark side of the moon, take back lunar samples, in effect looking for some of these rare earth minerals to see whether they could do, believe it or not, lunar mining. I know this is something that sounds crazy, but could actually be the case. So there has been more competition, and the US is very lucky in this case because the private sector has really boomed between SpaceX in particular, Blue Origin. I have a little example here of the number of active satellites, primarily commercial. And this really has been driven by SpaceX. You can see how quickly that has developed over the past couple of years in particular. And the point here, to quote the current new Secretary of Defense, is that space actually already is an area of great competition and probably will grow to be even more so down the road. So the final takeaways here, and then we'll open it up for questions on any of this material or otherwise. You can see, I'm not going to read the slide to you, but I think the real question that is interesting to talk about is because a lot of this strategic competition, quite frankly, does revolve around China, if we're going to be very candid, is whether the US should have something that is a more strategic perspective tying economic policy or industrial policy to American national interests and essentially US foreign policy too. So we have these two things. You have the traditional geopolitical world, like the Russians massing on the border of Ukraine, like the Chinese flying warplanes over Taiwanese airspace. And then you have these new areas that are mostly technology focused in the area of cyber, AI, semiconductors, digital currencies. These are becoming more and more heavily intertwined. And so, for a lot of you all who are in this space, you need to think about what type of policymaker will be needed down the line to try to help the United States and other countries think about this. So why don't we stop there? I saw there were some great questions that were already supplied ahead of time, and real happy to go through those. But I think what we're going to do is Margaret, I think, was probably going to ask, Margaret or Mari, ask the first question. And then we're going to go ahead and just go into the questions. So I really like to call on people. And what I would encourage you to do is to use the raise the hand function. I see all the participants here. I'll also be watching chat, although I think in this forum, you're mostly cut off from that. Go ahead, raise your hand, and I'm going to call on some people who may have good questions. So why don't I pause there?
Great, thank you very much. So just in true Kennedy School fashion, please keep your question brief and make sure to end it with a question mark. And Eric will be calling on folks as you raise your hand. So just to start things off with a question that was submitted earlier by Anirudh Suri, MPA 2014. And that question is, how will technology shape U.S. foreign policy in the world order in the coming decade? And are there multiple scenarios for how that might evolve?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a good one to pick out. That's really the framing question for a lot of what I was talking about. I don't know. And, I don't know that we have the answer, but I do think that recognizing technology will be increasingly a part of the geopolitical landscape. And here's the one thing I would say for sure is that I think a lot of this does show need for new type of talent to go into the government and policymaking positions. It's nothing against some of the people in the more senior jobs now, but you know what? Very few of them really understand a lot of this technology. I like to tell the story about, this was even 8 or 10 years ago now. We were first talking about cyber as something new, as if the internet was a new invention 10 years ago. And sitting in a meeting, in the National Security Council, where there were very few cabinet officials who even understood how the internet worked, more or less how we could create cyber options in response to cyber attacks. So think about that, and then think about something as complicated as a digital currency or AI and others, and you see that we need some new people. When it comes down to it, it's a lot about the talent that you have in there. Y'all go ahead, please raise your hand. I see one other hand up right now. And this is what I'd like you to do. When we unmute you as a participant, the next person is going to be AS. Just tell us a little bit who you are, where you're from, so we have a little bit more dynamic interaction here. Go ahead there, AS.
Sorry, I just had my initials there, but Eric, okay. Actually, this is Anirudh. Actually, we just asked.
Okay, all right. So you got double tapped. All right. I tell you what. For that. Why don't we, just to make sure we try to get as many people involved as possible. If there's no one else who has a question, I'll go back to you. But sure, otherwise, I see. Does that sound all right, Anirudh? The next person up is Malik. I'll go to Malik, and then I'll probably go to Rose, just so that y'all can be prepared here. I'll try to read out who's going to be next up. So Malik, hello, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Hello from Karachi.
Great.
Hello. I'm an MPID 2011. So I'm great to see the background of the Kennedy School. You can hear me loud and clear, correct?
Sorry, yeah, loud and clear. All good. Thank you.
Great. So one thing that has been quite interesting in this COVID scenario is that two types of societies have done very well. Societies that are very disciplined, societies with a very good command and control structure, and societies that are very homogeneous, which is mostly in Asia mostly in East Asia. They're very well, they did the management of COVID very well. Societies which are a bit more diverse, free for all, like the US and even UK, where you can't enforce discipline because there's a lot of diversity, they really struggle with it. So on one hand, you have that. On the other hand, what you have is societies that were innovative, Germany, US, even China. They have come up with a solution. They've been off the the vaccine race much quicker. So in terms of the future, when you project human society in a digital age with these kind of shocks like pandemics coming, what do you think would the Western societies keep the diversified composition, or do you think that there is a model to be more disciplined, more command and control, which would be more suited to the future state of the world?
Yeah, thank you, Malik. This is a pretty big and deep question. So I think, if I could, which is classic Kennedy School, I may try to take a shot at framing it in a way that's a little different, because I personally am not sure it's as much about diversity as it is about the system of government. And, that there are some places that tend to be more a liberal democracy and some places that are less. I think there is a correlation, and you're an MPAID, so I'm going to be careful talking about correlations with you, between, those societies that may happen to be less diverse too. But the real question you pose, which I think a good one, is, in an era where there are going to be global pandemics, global cyber war, free flow of information, what's the right model of government to be able to handle that? I think it's a really great point. I've been doing a little bit of research about that tied to the geopolitics of tech, and it won't surprise you that there are a lot of countries now that are looking to the Chinese model of economic policy and security policy and saying, that actually works better because, the population is locked down, we have more control, we can advance our industry and economic competitiveness. What really breaks that, though, is when you look at the fact that the countries that were able to generate the vaccines had a very free market economy, a crazy democracy that results in a lot of friction, but ultimately maybe is delivering the best too. So I think, there's an open question there, and that has implications definitely for the pandemic and global health. But I think, just for the way the world will work down the line, in general, the trend is that the democracy is on the wane. Fewer democratic nations, democracy overall under pressure. So I would love to hear someone think about that. Why don't I give you, Malik, we got a little time. Why don't you get a 30-second response to that real quick?
Great. I do think that the model of democracy is born out of the 18th century Enlightenment principles. It was based on a world which is mechanical energy, distance mattered, and people were coming together. But I do think democracy as a concept, the way it is constructed, is run its course, and I think it will change in another form, because the digital age is going to change things, just like the Industrial Revolution changed it in the Malthusian economy to a post-industrial age. So I do think all structures, all governance structures will change as a result of it. Democracy will also change. That is my feeling, because I do think that the tech is going to take humanity from one level, from an industrial to a digital age, and hence the way we are governed will also change.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a very insightful question. Rose Edwards, we were going to go to you next. Rose, go ahead, please.
Hi, good afternoon from London. Can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, we can hear you great.
Hi, my name's Rose Edwards. I'm a mid-career MPA from 2016. And this is to pick up on the comment you made with regards to what kind of policymaker will we need down the line to make sense of all this. To some degree informed by my experience at Kennedy. In the last year, I've been asked to lead a piece of work looking at whether or not the UK government should set up a college for national security. This has been going on for some months, but it was made public in the integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy that came out last month. I'm writing the business case for it in the next few months. How on earth, in writing the strategic bit of that business case, do I go about answering exactly the question that you put? Because the strategic aim is indeed to create a postgrad college such that we have a diverse, expert, skilled, curious, statistic able, Kennedy skilled, but not whilst not having been to Kennedy, kind of person who can operate internationally with allies and with industry and business and academia. How on earth do you go about pulling that off, given that this is so very complicated?
Wow, that's a big challenge for you. Good job, Rosie. You should let us know whether we can help you out. I think I maybe saw your question in the pre-questions too, about how do you teach national security? I have to say, which I hope doesn't, deflate morale too much. I'm not sure actually pursuing just a national security school is the best idea for the world we live in right now. I mean, quite frankly, what would be more important is that you find people who have the technology background and try to get them into government. So I guess if the idea is that with this national security school, it's a feeder then into the UK civil service, that could be pretty interesting. If the people who come, have more of a background in biology or, some of the things that would help with the pandemic or digital currency, and then you give them a national security background. Pretty interesting. You just want to make sure you don't take people who have a background more like mine, which is just traditional national security, and I'm always trying to learn the science and the tech, I think. In the US, there's something that's called the National Defense University and a National Intelligence University. Those tend to not be as successful, I would say, as some of the regular academic run programs like the Kennedy School or Columbia or Georgetown. So it's pretty interesting. I think it's really important, though, now in particular in the national security world, that if there's a university like that, you find a way to attract diverse candidates to it, because right now it continues to be hard, to get a diverse population, both gender, ethnicity, all those things that are important into the defense world, the intelligence world. It is a major problem, which results in poorer policy outcomes from my perspective. What do you think about all that, Rose?
I agree with everything you've said, and that's indeed part of the thinking. So it's very much a college in the sense of a community of people where there would indeed be formal training programs which lead to qualifications, but it's as much about creating networks that are porous across government and non-government staff passes, so from across the full range of national security departments, but where people in business, people in industry and allies are as much part of essentially the party and the ideas, because government doesn't run this anymore in the way it might have thought it did, even if it really did then when it thought it did.
That's great. I almost wish there could be something that's more international. I don't know whether it's NATO or otherwise. Executive education, also another way to look at that. I will say one of the things, I do think the Biden administration has done a very good job getting younger, newer, diverse talent into the national security world than any time I've seen before. And I feel like I have a pretty good perspective on this because I've been able to help lots of students and former students get into political appointee jobs. And most of them, quite frankly, never envisioned working in the Pentagon. And they definitely, don't look like me and don't have a background like I do, which I see as a very positive development. So we need to keep making progress on that. Next up, I was going to go to Bruno. And after Bruno, I was going to go to Stephanie. Bruno, go ahead.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this conference. It's quite interesting, and it's always great to hear you. So I did the executive education in 2012, and I've been running and leading humanitarian missions a bit all over the world. Well, I was in Congo and DRC, Sierra Leone, well, Angola, Tegucigalpa, many other countries. My question here is that, and I made a previous question. I wrote a question about the situation between Israel and Palestine and the impacts of this situation into the U.S. National security. But by chance, just yesterday, I got to know that I will go to Kandahar and I will lead a mission there. And it's quite funny, well, not funny, but quite interesting that I've been reading all these information about the US forces being retrieved back to the country, but then it seems that it is not a complete withdrawal. And I've been reading that there's a lot of impacts, not just in Afghanistan, but as well into the international US policy. So I would like just to, to hear a little bit about what you think about the US international policy and the impacts in the national security. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bruno. So we'll do both real quick. I think, the situation with Israel is always complicated, but it's probably even more complicated right now because of the Iranian nuclear program. The fact that the Israeli government right now is kind of a mess, but also pretty, I would say, antagonistic with the Biden administration from everything that I understand. Here's a perfect example. The day that the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, was visiting Israel is when the news broke that there had been an offensive cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear facility. So maybe that was coincidental, but you know what? The Israelis have this history of almost trying to embarrass senior American officials when they come to Israel. I could tell you a lot of stories about the times we tried to save Ash Carter from public embarrassment with Netanyahu. So that I think will continue to be pretty tense as it relates to Palestine. When things are tense with Israel, it's hard to make progress on that issue, which I think is pretty important. On Afghanistan, from everything I understand, it is a complete withdrawal by September 11th of this year. There are about 2,500 troops left, and from everything I've read, it's the entire lot out. I would love to hear what some other people on the call think about this. I saw some folks who I know served in Afghanistan and either were or are active duty, to see what you think. Personally, I think it is the right decision. It's a hard decision, but we've been there a long time. I'm not sure how much more progress we're going to make. And it's just so sad, when you see people dying, Americans dying for that. That doesn't at all discount the fact that I'm sure it'll be really hard for a lot of Afghans, if the Taliban does take over. So, very sympathetic to that too. But I think for the US, it probably is the right thing to do. So thank you very much, Bruno. I'm going to go next to Stephanie. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Good afternoon, Eric. This is Stephanie Sanok Kostro, MPP 1998, which I'm not going to do the math, but makes me not the kind of tech person that you'd be looking for to hire into the government right now.
Age is all relative when that comes.
Exactly. It's about the knowledge, right? But just to riff a little bit off of what you were just discussing in terms of Afghanistan, I left Capitol Hill back in 2008 to go to Embassy Baghdad to help with the transition planning that was to lead to the US military withdrawal from that country. Or rather, I was at Embassy Baghdad, and so we were doing the joint campaign plan. And I just hope that as we withdraw from Afghanistan, and I think it's a good idea, that there has been some rigor in terms of the planning of what missions are essential. Will we hand back to the government of Afghanistan in total what State Department will be in charge of, what USAID will do, and what our contractors do. I'm now the executive vice president for policy at a professional services council, which represents more than 500 government contracting companies, some of which work in Afghanistan. And I know they're very worried about this announcement and what it means for them and their safety. But that was not my question. My question is, I want to bring it back a little bit to your presentation, which is to say, I've been really heartened by the Biden administration's renewed emphasis on partnership, allies, leveraging the international community and whatever role the US wants to take in that forum. But I'm trying to balance that with some of the protectionist issues that have been cropping up. And you mentioned semiconductors, 5G, artificial intelligence. In recently passed legislation, clearly Congress has taken somewhat of a protectionist bent towards supporting domestic industries in all of those areas. And I was curious as to your thoughts on how do you balance the desire to engage in the international community on things like global health, climate change, and the full spectrum of global issues, while also trying to support domestic industries here in the United States?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. First of all, I think it's a great point that we hopefully don't redo what happened after the pullout of Iraq in 2008, with the rise of ISIS, but that seems less likely now. So we'll have to watch, but hopefully it doesn't turn out that way. I think it's an important question about, what do you do to try to strengthen the American economy without, kind of undermining what has always been a strength of the United States, which is an open economy, a free market. That said, there needs to be a level playing field and people playing by the same rules. And I do think that even in the past administration and currently with the Biden administration, that some of the things that have been put into place with tariffs and export controls have put pressure on China in a way that has opened up the global economy in a way that is fair to everyone, including a lot of domestic US industry. So I think that will be hard for a while, but right now there seems to be a trend of countries like the United States that value democracy first and mostly an open market economy, agreeing that there does need to be a change. So as long as we continue to build our alliances and re-strengthen those, Asia in particular, I think that the balance will be okay, quite frankly. And, the US probably needs 5 years of really focusing on domestic reconstruction, so to speak, and take care of some things here before we really open up again. But, that's not my area of expertise. So you may have a different thought on that too. If you want to give a real quick response, Stephanie, that'd be great. And then we're going to go to Monty. And after Monty, go to Judith. Stephanie, any quick response to that?
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, I think some of the younger folks who you've mentioned getting into the Biden administration have some really great innovative thoughts on how to go about supporting the US economy in ways that it has atrophied, to be honest, over the course of the last few decades. My concern, though, remains that, if we go too far in terms of domestic content or whatnot, we may end up having less of a free and open, free flow of goods and services across international borders. And that's something worth watching, I think. So
right. Yeah,
that's all I have to add
absolutely.
to that.
Yeah, good point. Thank you so much. Monty, why don't you go ahead, please?
Thank you. Monty, at this point, calling in from Toronto, Canada, attributed to COVID. However, prior to that, my work is in Kinshasa, DRC, where at present I teach les droits administratifs publics pro bono. And prior to that, served with the UN UNDP for over 30 years, illustrating how much I do not know in regions post-conflict. My question to you, and you've circumscribed the issue in the sense that national security, in a sense, is personal security, then it also devolves into what I consider to be constructive development, which I believe will be enhanced by the incoming director of USAID, Sam Power, who is extremely passionate, which I believe is important. However, discipline is important as well. And the concern I have is the best in development aid is that which is embedded nationally within the state or nation, and there is a difference, and is not transactional, but it allows and affords locals to learn and make mistakes, because you can only learn by making mistake. And the United States, and I've been privileged working with your military, I hold them in the highest respect and regard, is how can governments deal with this? Because in terms of voting publics, they look, whether it's Congress for 2 years or President 4 years, they want to see immediate return. Where in broad issues, national security, this is multi-generational because hatred and bias is an acquired taste. You don't learn it. I thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for what you're doing there too, Monty. Yeah, I think it's, first of all, great that Samantha will be there, and she is going to have a little bit of a different role because she's not only the director, the administrator of USAID, but she's going to be on the National Security Council. So that gives that organization literally a seat at the table when we're having very strategic conversations about important issues. And Samantha, obviously a very seasoned operator there, and has a lot of trust with the senior people. So I think that will help put a new perspective for development on the agenda. I'm not sure exactly, how quickly you can change the way AID works. That's a pretty big bureaucracy, and even someone like Samantha, I'm not sure can change it overnight. But the approach that you're talking about sounds right to me. You want to build some local capacity, hold people accountable in a way that doesn't always happen in that world either. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that works out, and very encouraged by that. And again, some great Kennedy School people in there at the top, and also she's taken some folks with her, lower down too. So, okay, great. Thank you, Monty. I'm going to go next to Judith. Go ahead, Judith. And then next was going to go to Howard.
Hi, this is Judith Benardete, actually an HBS grad and former Dean's Council member at the Kennedy School.
Okay,
so
great.
My question is going to be predictably about money. And the question is, why, given the need to hire artificial intelligence people with expertise and immigration expertise, instead of trying to cherry pick them once they graduate from somewhere like the Kennedy School or the Harris School, why aren't we investing in them? Sports teams invest in kids in high school. Why aren't we investing in them, and putting them through the equivalent of an ROTC program? As I remember from my days at MIT, that you had these big programs there. It avoids the problem of trying, the limiting factor are the faculty. You can start a school on its own, a dedicated school, but how do you get the breadth and the richness of the faculty you have at the Kennedy School or at Harvard in one of those schools? So why wouldn't the government take a page out of the COVID vaccine investment strategy and say, wow, let's throw money at this and very cost effectively put kids in an ROTC program from freshman year in college, and just create an elite program like that with an obligation to pay back.
Yeah. Thank you, Judy. I think that's a really interesting point. And there are a couple things that you could use as a model for this idea. So, for example, 10 years ago, when cyber was a new thing, which again seems kind of funny now, we saw that there was a huge lack of talent in that space, and did actually start ROTC-like programs to bolster students' understanding of cybersecurity issues. Even started a new branch in the U.S. Army. It's a cyber branch. You could see doing something very similar to that, and then even having graduates from that program from universities all around the country then go in and do some type of service, probably not just in the military, but also in government. I think that would be very appealing, not just the military. So you could choose to do your service in a civilian part of the government. Another interesting idea for doing this is trying to find talent that exists out there, maybe even in the private sector, and giving them the opportunity to come into government for 2, 3, 4 years. Right now, there's something called the U.S. Digital Service. And one of the faculty at the Kennedy School, Kathy Pham, was one of the original founders of the U.S. Digital Service. We started a defense digital service when I was chief of staff. And it was really a pretty cool idea. We got, these very high-end engineers who'd just been working at Google or Microsoft or small startups, asked them if they would come work in government for 3 years at a government salary, which is nothing compared to what they're making in the private sector. And there was a huge interest in doing it and demand, because they wanted to solve all these really hard tech problems, some in AI, some having to do with space and GPS. So I think there are ways you can do it, but there just has to be the will there from some senior folks and people who are willing to just crush the bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy itself is not always open, to new innovative ideas for outsiders or ways of educating. But that's a great idea. Any other thoughts on that, Judy?
Well, I think, I think it could be useful. I do agree completely that it would not be a military focused thing. And it would also allow, I like the idea, rather than sort of the Teach for America model of going in for 2 or 3 years, you're really trying to build an elite core that will make their career there. And their friends from college will all be in there, and they will, by the time you get out of one of these graduate schools, you have so many options. And in my experience, it was more, so anyways, I think that the idea of a core that would be there, and really you'll lose some after their obligation is met, but many more will stay in. And a reserve corps can be another alternative. Instead of having a 3-year commitment, maybe you create a reserve corps who can be called up from time to time, supplementary rather than those that can afford to take off a few years. I think you want to
Yeah.
avoid sort of the elitism that comes from, the luxury of being able to leave a graduate school and choose a career in something where you're making a quarter of the money you'd make elsewhere.
I really agree with that. That's a great point. I would say another thing I think is really important in addressing the overall shortfall in areas like AI expertise, a lot in the biofield, is that the U.S. needs to change immigration policy in a way that for a lot of high-end tech talent that graduates from U.S. universities, like automatically get them a green card, because there are many, many of those students who want to stay here, including a lot of the top, Chinese national engineers. In a way, that could be one of our greatest assets in the strategic competition if the high-end talent is staying here in the U.S. too. So thank you very much, Judy. Howard, you're up next, and then I'm going to go to Mo Khan. Go ahead there, Howard.
Hey, Eric, it's Howard Cohen. Great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you too, or hear you anyway. I can't see your picture. I hope things are going well with you.
Things are going great. So MPP class of 2018, where I had a great research supervisor, just saying. And I'm currently in New York. I spent most of my career as a tech entrepreneur, but I'm currently working for Facebook. Just to piggyback on some of the topic that you were just talking about, I'm curious to know what you think are some of the greatest opportunities for private and public sector collaboration around cybersecurity or other topics that you touched on in your presentation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good question. Yeah, I know you've been working on some of this stuff too, which is great. I think that the U.S. government can't do much of this on its own, quite frankly. It used to be the case that, with the National Security Agency, they'd be able to take care of a lot of the cybersecurity issues. But now, when you see things like the SolarWinds attack, you recognize that you need a lot of private sector buy-in. I think that it's actually been really encouraging the last several years in particular, how much the private sector has emerged to play a major role in keeping both individuals and organizations in the country safe. If you look at a firm like CrowdStrike or Mandiant, they're doing a lot to help on that. But it's in areas of thinking about probably using AI for defense where there could be greater collaboration. I think there should be some sort of collaboration in the area of digital currencies and building a framework and even the technology that would really improve Americans' confidence and trust in a digital currency would be a great place. This is not tech collaboration, but I think and feel really strongly that the United States needs a national data security law. Right now, there's nothing like that in the US. Most firms have to default either to New York or California or figure out what to comply with for either their sector or their state in terms of privacy and data security. And if the private sector could get on board with one standard, it could really move a law like that. I know a lot of corporate executives and board members right now are very frustrated by the fact they have to figure out this patchwork law of privacy and data security laws. So that'd be one policy idea where there could be some collaboration. Thanks a lot, Howard. That was a great question. Hope that you're doing well there. Wanted to go and get a question from Mo Khan. Mo, how are you doing?
Great. Hi. Nice to hear your voice.
Nice to hear your voice too.
Yeah, and you look the same from however long ago, 2008. I don't even want to date
myself. Yeah, I think the camera must be making it look better than it is, Mo, though. So. Oh no, it looks like Mo, did you drop off? Okay, well, it looks like Mo dropped off somehow. We'll get her right back. And maybe the team can help out here too. Let's see. Since Mo dropped off, why don't we go to Fred? Fred Taylor, how are you doing?
Wonderful. Good to see you. Thank you for taking the time out today.
Absolutely. We'll do Fred, and then I see Mo's back on there. We'll go back to Mo. Go ahead, Fred. How are you?
Oh, well, good. Fred Taylor, National Security Fellow, 2011. Since leaving the military, I have now worked for a company with Viasat Broadband Satellite ISP. And wanted to kind of frame a question here, is that if you accept that data is kind of the new oil of the world, And as part of that is that you have requirements for strategic networks, and you have needs for strategic choke points. Where traditionally on the terrestrial world, you look at, the Arctic crossing or Panama Canal or something like that, and there's checkpoints and very clear in terms of how the data flows and connectivity pieces fit together. From a national security standpoint, when you think about data and connectivity, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, how would you address those things and the national security implications from a very fluid world that is not necessarily controlled physically in an environment, and even from a cyber aspect where everyone has access to, say, space capabilities for connectivity, the ability to share and move data and information? So the question is, what are the national security implications and decisions that would kind of surround policy arrangements with industry partners and other organizations that don't necessarily play in the national security framework traditionally?
Yeah, it's a great question, Fred. I remember you working in the space segment back then 10 years ago. So it's great to hear that you're still in that, even though you're not in the Air Force anymore.
Yes, sir. Back in Colorado, but
yeah, okay. You don't have to call me sir. Definitely not now. That's for sure. I think it's like this. You'll sometimes hear, mostly from people who either are or have worked at the NSA, that we should set up some type of strategic capability where you'd be able to monitor and respond to incoming cyber attacks from, nation state actors like the Russians or the Chinese, maybe the Iranians, the North Koreans. I have always thought that's a completely unrealistic idea, both technically and, from like the philosophy of the United States and legal constraints too. So that leads me to the point where I think this should be, again, much more where private sector organizations are either expected to or taking more responsibility to mitigate their cyber risk. And when they don't, that there are just very clear-cut repercussions for that right now. That has improved a lot over the last 10 years. CEOs are actually getting fired, litigation forcing people to invest more in cybersecurity. But another reason why I think a national data security law would be that type of public policy instrument you needed to essentially address, some of the, we'll be super wonky Kennedy School people, negative externalities that are essentially hoisted upon the public right now for firms that underinvest in this. So I'm not sure it's an infrastructure thing or technical thing as much as it is a policy solution. I would say, because you're a space person, that that we should think a lot about the cybersecurity of space. All those satellites that are going up, they're part of the internet in most cases, and quite vulnerable, both from physical and cyber attack. So that's a huge area for people who are looking for a new experience in cybersecurity. Think about the nexus with space.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Fred. Thanks very much. Okay, I think we have Mo back up. Mo, you there?
Yeah, thanks. So my question is actually regarding South Asia. I'd love to get some of your thoughts on what the Biden administration's priorities might be. And I've been living in Dhaka off and on since pretty much graduation. And I've really noticed a shift where China and India really are the dominant players, whether it's economically or in other ways. And I feel the US has been almost playing catch up in more of a reactive role and really trying to get back into the swing of things, whereas before that was not the case. So I'd love your viewpoint on South Asia, particularly Bangladesh and China and India.
Okay, great. Great question, Mo. Thank you very much. It's cool to be back in touch with you too. Not surprising to you, I think the focus of the administration when it comes to South Asia will be on trying to strengthen, a partnership with India that really has developed a lot over the last, several years, the last decade. Whereas before, India, self-identified still as part of the non-aligned movement, would tend to buy a lot of military stuff from the Russians before the US. That has all started to change. The domestic situation in India right now, to me, is kind of troublesome. When you see some of the things that Modi is doing based on ethnicity or religion, I think we need to put more pressure on him to uphold human rights and have a real democracy. I think some of that has had spillover into Bangladesh. And I would just say that I think this idea that you outlined of strategic competition with a country like Bangladesh is really important, because the U.S. wants to be close with a country like Bangladesh, where economic growth is quite frankly, I think, more. There's a lot more to admire there compared to Pakistan. There are a lot of studies that I've looked at. So I hope that works. I hate to say it, but unfortunately, it probably is not at the top of the agenda when it comes to Bangladesh. But maybe Mo, you can like stir something up and get going there. The last question I wanted to finish with is actually Malcolm Wiener. Malcolm, how are you doing? It's great that you're here. Thank you for having us put this whole thing together too. And nice to see at least your picture again. How are you?
Well, thank you for an 86-year-old. I've been wondering whether it might be possible to create a high-sci West Point plus a high-sci ROTC program where promising students would be given a free ride through the equivalent of college and graduate school in exchange for years of service. Seems to me these are the areas of major threat to the country, just as much as Army or Navy attack, and that's an obvious response consistent with our traditions and experience.
I think it's a great idea. That's an even more amped up version along the lines of what Judy was talking about, where you establish a new educational institution. And, I obviously am biased, but investing in something like that seems to be so likely to have a huge return on investment compared to the cost you need to get up and running. And I think that we should look very seriously at that. I think one positive indicator is that the existing military service academies and organizations like Georgia Tech or Caltech or RIT, or even, some state schools and community colleges have done a great job developing education curriculum that is putting people in the workforce, that also, has helped a lot with equity concerns and not just being, people from elite parts of the country and backgrounds. But I like that idea a lot, Malcolm. And at the Kennedy School, we're working really hard on trying to put into the curriculum, for MPPs in particular, more background on things like AI, using digital platforms, using geospatial tools to do public policy analysis, because I think it will result in better outcomes. And students also then just have a better feel for the technology too. But give us some more feedback and thoughts on that, Malcolm.
Well, it suddenly dawns on me that we've always done it, but only in a tiny way. One of my classmates at Harvard, an NROTC, which paid my way through Harvard since I came from a poor family, majored in physics. And when he graduated, he got a message that said, don't even bother buying a naval uniform, just report to such and such a facility. And he served out his naval service doing high-level physics. We could simply make that a program and do it on a larger scale.
Right. I think it's a great idea. I also did ROTC, but was a poli-sci major, and more of a meathead than you, I'm sure, and learned all of my tech stuff while working in an NSA post, which is another advantage of an experience like that. I didn't learn it in school, but learned a lot of it by working some operations around there. So you could see that being in addition to an academy like that, then placing them in the workforce where they'd get a lot of experience that could help the private sector too and bolster that nexus, I think. So thank you so much, Malcolm. We're at the top of the hour now. And I just really wanted to thank Malcolm again and thank all of you for showing up to participate. It's really interesting for me to also hear your thoughts and hopefully, got some things going up there, your wheels turning for you as well. Thank you for everything you do out in the real world. That's what the Kennedy School is all about. I know you're doing that in one way or another. So thank you for that. And let us know if there's anything we can do to help you out down the road. So with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Margaret.
Yeah, hi.
Or
Actually,
Mari.
just wanted to thank everyone who called in, and apologies that we weren't able to get to everyone's questions. And just to note that our next Wiener Conference Call will be held on April 29th with Jason Furman, who will discuss the economic effects of the pandemic. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.